You stand ankle deep in mud. The air reeks of sweat, blood, and smoke. Arrows whistle overhead like a storm of deadly hail. The ground shakes as thousands of men clash in a storm of steel and screams. Out of the chaos, a towering knight in gleaming plate charges toward you. His armor reflects the sunlight like a mirror of death. You thrust your weapon with all your strength, only to feel your blade glance off his chest, as if you had struck solid stone. The knight does not flinch. He raises his sword. In that moment you realize you are not fighting a man, you are fighting the very idea of invincibility. This was the reality of medieval armor, not a fancy costume. Not a Hollywood prop, but a technological marvel that changed warfare, society, and even human psychology for centuries. To understand armor is to understand the beating heart of the Middle Ages. Why armor mattered in an age where life was fragile. Armor was survival itself. For a knight, it was the line between going home to feast with your family or becoming carrion for crows. Armor didn't just protect flesh and bone, it protected the feudal system, aristocratic dominance, and the myth of knightly invincibility. To peasants, knights seemed like gods of war. To kings, they were the iron spine of armies. To enemies, they were the embodiment of terror. Armor wasn't static. It evolved for nearly 1,000 years, constantly adapting to new threats. Every rivet, every curve of steel, every joint was the result of centuries of blood-soaked innovation. Mail and early protection. The story begins long before knights in shining plate. Early medieval warriors relied on mail armor, a mesh of thousands of interlinked iron rings. Known as chainmail, today it was a wonder of craftsmanship. A single shirt, called a hauberk, could contain over 30 000 rings, each painstakingly riveted by hand. Mail did not make you invincible. A sword might not cut through it, but the force could still break bones beneath. Arrows sometimes found gaps, and heavy weapons like axes could smash through with enough force. Still, for centuries, mail was the gold standard of protection. At Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror's Norman knights wore mail hauberks, conical helmets, and kite-shaped shields. Against lightly armed Anglo-Saxon infantry, they were terrifying juggernauts. But as weapons grew deadlier, mail began to fail. By the 13th century, crossbows could punch through. Warriors needed something stronger. The transition to plate armorers answered the challenge with transitional armor iron plates added over mail. First, simple knee guards and elbow cops, then larger breastplates. By the late 13th century, knights resembled patchwork machines, their bodies covered in steel plates strapped over chainmail. This transition marked the beginning of a revolution. Metallurgy advanced. Armorers discovered how to harden and temper steel. By shaping plates into curves, they learned to deflect blows rather than absorb them. The full suit of plate armor was born in the 14th century, and with it, the knight became nearly unstoppable. The technological marvel of plate armor forget the myth of clumsy, waddling knights. A well-made suit of plate was a masterpiece of design, weighing between 45-55 pounds, less than what a modern soldier carries. It distributed weight evenly across the body. A properly fitted suit felt more like a heavy jacket than a prison. Knights could run, jump, and even mount horses unassisted. Armorers were engineers before their time. They shaped breastplates with complex curves to deflect swords and arrows. Helmets had visors with breathing holes and slits, angled to prevent blades from slipping through. Articulated joints allowed arms and legs to bend freely while staying protected. Each suit was custom-made, fitted precisely to its owner. No one size fits all. A master armorer might spend months hammering, tempering, and polishing a single breastplate. The cost was staggering. Equipping a knight could equal hundreds of thousands of modern dollars, a price only nobles and elites could afford. Armor myths vs. reality. Hollywood loves to lie about armor. Let's destroy the biggest myths. Armor was too heavy to move in. False. Knights trained from childhood to fight in armor. They wrestled, jousted, sprinted, and fought for hours. Contemporary accounts describe knights climbing ladders, performing somersaults, and leaping onto horses fully armored. Knights needed cranes to mount horses. This myth comes from tournament armor, which was heavier than battlefield gear. Real combat plate was mobile. Armor made you suffocate or collapse from heat. Yes, it was hot and exhausting, but manageable with training. Knights were conditioned athletes. Any peasant could kill a knight with a spear. Not true. A spear could be deadly, but against high-quality plate, most peasants' weapons simply bounced off. Armor was not perfect, but against the swords, arrows, and spears of its time, it was as close to invincibility as medieval technology could achieve. The Battle of Agincourt 1415. No story shows armor's effectiveness better than Agincourt. The English longbowmen unleashed a storm of arrows. Tens of thousands of shafts darkened the sky. Against unarmored men, it was death itself. Against French knights in plate, many arrows shattered or glanced away harmlessly. Chroniclers describe the French advancing despite the deadly hail, their armor protecting them from what should have been certain death. The English won not because arrows pierced armor, but because mud, exhaustion, and tactical genius trapped the French knights. Armor made them nearly immune to arrows, but it couldn't save them from being swarmed, dragged down, and suffocated in the press of battle. Knights as living tanks. Imagine you are a peasant soldier. You wear padded cloth, maybe a rusty helmet. Suddenly, through the smoke, a knight appears, towering in polished steel, arrows bouncing off like rain. You stab your spear, it glances away, your courage dies in your chest. Armor wasn't just protection, it was a weapon of psychological warfare. The sight of armored knights could shatter morale before the first clash. Soldiers spoke of them as monsters, iron men, or walking fortresses. The fear they inspired was as valuable as the steel they wore. Armor and social order, but armor was more than military gear. It was status on display. A gleaming suit of plate wasn't just survival. It was a declaration: I am powerful, I am noble, I am above you. In an age when most peasants owned nothing beyond rags and tools, armor represented unimaginable wealth. This economic barrier shaped society. Knights weren't just skilled fighters. They were rich men whose equipment made them nearly untouchable. Laws even required men to own armor based on wealth. The feudal pyramid of armies reflected this, a tiny elite of armored knights at the top, men-at-arms with partial protection beneath them, and masses of poorly equipped peasants at the bottom. Armor thus reinforced the very structure of medieval Europe. It wasn't just military, it was political. Armor as identity in the chaos of battle, knowing friend from foe was life or death. Armor became a canvas for identity. Shields bore heraldry, helmets had plumes, breastplates were etched with designs. From a distance, you could tell which knight was yours, which was enemy, and who commanded respect. Armor made individuals recognizable, even legendary. The sight of a famous knight's crest could rally allies or terrify enemies. Armor was not just steel. It was story, symbol, and reputation forged into metal. An age of invincibility, but not forever. For centuries, armor dominated warfare. It saved lives, terrified enemies, and preserved social order. But nothing in history lasts forever. Even as knights shone in glory, new weapons were being born, designed for one purpose: to defeat the steel shell of plate, warhammers, maces, poleaxes, crossbows. And finally, gunpowder. Armor would rise higher still, but the seeds of its downfall were already sown. The beginning of the arms race. By the mid-14th century, plate armor had reached its peak. A knight clad in gleaming steel could shrug off arrows, swords, and spears. To common soldiers, he looked invincible, but in warfare, nothing stays invincible for long. For every defense, there is a counter, and so began one of the longest arms races in military history: weapons versus armor. If armor made you immune to blades, warriors needed weapons that crushed rather than cut. If arrows couldn't pierce steel, then bows had to evolve into machines of terrifying power. Each generation of soldiers answered new armor with deadlier weapons, and each generation of armorers responded by making their craft stronger, harder, smarter. Blunt force. The rise of maces and warhammers, the sword, once the king of weapons, began to fade in dominance. Against chainmail it had been deadly, against plate it was useless. Strikes slid off harmlessly, so soldiers turned to maces and warhammers. These were not crude clubs, but precision tools of destruction. A warhammer could deliver a concentrated shock strong enough to dent or even fracture plate armor. A mace could transfer bone, crushing force through the steel. The irony was dark. The very protection meant to save a knight's life could become the weapon that killed him. his own armor caving inward under the blow. Polearms, the soldier's answer for infantry, the weapon of choice became the polearm, long shafts tipped with steel axes, spikes, or hooks. The halberd could chop, stab, and hook knights from their horses. The poleaxe, wielded by men-at-arms, was designed specifically for fighting armored opponents, part hammer, part axe, part spear. Close combat became brutal grappling matches. Knights didn't just swing swords. They wrestled, tripped, and forced each other to the ground, where they could stab daggers into the vulnerable gaps of armor, under the arms, through the visor, or into the groin. This was called murder, stroke, ugly, personal, and far removed from the chivalric duels of romance. The arrow problem. Crossbows and longbows, but armor's greatest test came not from blunt force, but from projectiles. The crossbow was the first weapon to truly terrify knights. With mechanical leverage, a trained peasant could unleash a bolt capable of piercing mail and even thinner plate. Popes tried to ban crossbows, calling them inhumane, because they leveled the playing field between commoner and knight. But it was too late. The weapon spread like wildfire. Then came the English longbow, a 6-foot monster of yew wood that could hurl arrows with devastating power. At Crécy 1346 and Agincourt 1415, English archers mowed down French knights by the thousands. Yet here lies the nuance. Arrows often failed to penetrate the best plate armor. What killed knights wasn't always the arrow. It was exhaustion, mud, and the sheer chaos created by endless volleys. Armor was holding strong. But a storm was coming. Gunpowder, the beginning of the end. When the first hand-held firearms appeared in Europe during the 14th century, they seemed like toys, loud, smoky, slow, and inaccurate. But they had one terrifying feature. Their iron balls could punch through steel plate. At first, armorers responded by making thicker, heavier suits. The heaviest breastplates, sometimes called proofed armor, were tested by firing pistols at them. Surviving dents can still be seen on museum pieces today, proof of their strength. But this solution came with a price. The heavier the armor, the less mobile the knight. By the 16th century, gunpowder weapons grew deadlier, cheaper, and more reliable. Muskets could kill from hundreds of yards away. Suddenly, even the richest noble's armor could not guarantee survival. The knight, once a symbol of invincibility, became obsolete. The social collapse of knighthood, the decline of armor, wasn't just military, it was social. For centuries, the knight's dominance rested on two pillars, training and armor. Training could still matter, but when a common peasant with a musket could kill a nobleman in plate, the playing field leveled overnight. The feudal system cracked. Nobles could no longer guarantee power through armored cavalry. Kings no longer relied on knights, but on professional standing armies of soldiers armed with guns. Armor's downfall reshaped Europe. Castles, once impregnable, crumbled before cannons. Warfare shifted from noble duels to massed firepower. The medieval world ended, replaced by the brutal modernity of gunpowder empires. Armor's final standstill, armor refused to vanish overnight. Cavalry in the 16th century wore three-quarter plate. Officers in the 17th century wore cuirasses, breastplates proofed against pistol fire. Even in the Napoleonic Wars, some heavy cavalry wore breastplates and helmets. But these were relics of a dying age. By the 18th century, armor was ceremonial more than practical. The age of knights in steel was over. The psychological legacy, even after its decline, armor left a permanent scar on the human imagination. The image of the knight in shining armor became legend, immortalized in stories of chivalry, romance, and myth. Armor inspired awe, fear, and respect in equal measure. And while muskets and cannons destroyed its practical use, they never destroyed its symbolic power. Today, when we see armor in museums, films, or literature, we don't just see steel. We see the echoes of an age when men wrapped themselves in iron and dared to stand as living fortresses. The hidden truth: armor was civilization itself. Armor was never just technology. It was society. It decided who ruled and who obeyed, who lived and who died. It shaped laws, armies, architecture, even religion. For nearly 1,000 years, armor was the skeleton upon which medieval Europe was built. Its fall was not merely the end of a tool, it was the end of an entire way of life. Gunpowder didn't just kill knights, it killed feudalism, chivalry, and the medieval world. From steel to gunpowder, From knights to soldiers, the story of medieval armor is the story of human ingenuity. It shows how desperate we are to survive, how creative we are in the face of death, and how no advantage lasts forever. Armor rose from simple mail to masterpieces of plate. It forced weapons to evolve, shaped battlefields, and made knights into gods of war. But just as it reached its peak, it fell, brought down by fire and lead, and yet its spirit survives. In every superhero's armor, in every soldier's bulletproof vest, in every story of knights and honor, the shadow of medieval armor lives on. So next time you see a gleaming suit of plate in a museum, don't think of it as a relic. Think of it as the heartbeat of an age, an iron shell that once held up the world.